My wife chose to dance with her boss that night. A couple's party. The music was low, glasses clinked, fake smiles on polite faces. I was there, beside her, extending my hand, inviting her with a shy yet affectionate gesture to dance with me. But she smiled, turned to him, and went. Without hesitation. Without looking back. And then everything inside me shattered. It wasn't just a dance. It was the clear symbol of a choice. It was as if she had drawn a full stop to the us I thought still existed. I felt my chest tear open, as if it were being ripped open without anesthesia. The party continued as if nothing had happened. As if there wasn't a soul being shattered there in the corner of the room. When we got home, the silence was louder than any song that had played that night. I closed the door behind us and turned. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just said, with the calm of someone with nothing left to lose, I want a divorce. She paled. She tried to laugh it off, tried to dismiss it as a tantrum, but my eyes didn't lie. I was determined. I asked her to be honest. I asked her not to treat me like an idiot, to tell me the truth, naked and raw, no matter how painful. And she did. She said it with the coldness of someone who no longer felt anything for me, or was pretending not to. She said she was in love with her boss. That everything with me was history. That I was routine, while he was new. That love no longer existed and that she just didn't have the courage to be the first to say it. It was like a blow to the gut, but I didn't stop her from speaking. She needed to spit it out. I needed to hear it. When she finished, her eyes slightly watery and her voice hesitant, I just took a deep breath and, with tears streaming down my face, said, I truly loved you. And I hope he can do the same. I grabbed some clothes and an old backpack and left. And as I walked the empty city streets that early morning, with only the distant sound of cars and my heart in tatters, I felt something inside me dying. Something big. Something that wouldn't return. The love I felt for her still burned in my chest, but with it came the pain of contempt. How could someone you love simply exchange the love you offer for a fantasy? For a momentary desire? For someone who barely knows your heart? It ate away at me. I relived the moments with her like torturous projections in my mind, the day she said, yes, the way she looked at me in the beginning, the laughter during simple dinners, the lazy Sundays, and now all of that was dust, forgotten, replaced by an interest that grew in the environment where she spent more time than with me. The strangest, or cruelest, thing was realizing that she hadn't just betrayed me physically. She'd betrayed me soul-wise. Physical betrayal is a wound, but emotional betrayal is an amputation. You feel as if a part of you had been ripped away. And worst of all, voluntarily. As if she'd looked at me, at everything we'd built, and said, this isn't enough. I spent days sleeping on a friend's couch, unable to eat, unable to see my own reflection. What if I'd been better? What if I'd been more present? What if she simply needed something I failed to offer? But deep down, I knew. I gave it my all. I gave it my best. But someone's best is no good for someone who chooses to desire what is temporary. Months passed. She sent me cold messages about paperwork, bills, bureaucracy. No sincere questions about me. No words that gave me hope. Until one day, silence. A disappearance that initially relieved me, but then caused me unease. Until she appeared. She knocked on my door. Eyes puffy. Makeup smeared. And with a trembling voice, she handed me a letter. A worn, folded sheet of paper, with nervous handwriting. She simply said, read it when you're alone. And she left. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the paper with trembling hands. The letter began with heavy words, I destroyed the only man who ever truly loved me. And I only realized it when it was too late. She described the emptiness, the illusion, the fall. She said the new love was nothing more than euphoria. That the spark that seemed new faded in the second month. That he had exchanged her, just as she had exchanged me. That now she saw the value she had lost. But what struck me was the final line, "I understand if you don't forgive me. But every day, as I sleep, I ask forgiveness from someone who loved me completely. I destroyed our love. And only now do I understand how rare it was." And in that instant, something in me changed. I didn't cry. I just got up, put on my jacket, and walked out. I went to where she lived and knocked on the door. She opened it. And saw me. There was no anger. No desire. Just a melancholy peace. I looked into her eyes and said, "I forgive you. But I'm not yours anymore." She tried to say something, but fell silent. She knew. Her time with me was over. The true love she once had become a memory. From that day forward, I rebuilt. Brick by brick. Wound by wound. I discovered that forgiveness is more for those who suffer than for those who hurt. I needed to forgive her to free myself. And so I did. I began to walk again, to smile again, to live again. And on an ordinary day, in a small corner cafe, I encountered a new gaze. A gaze that asked for nothing in return. That didn't demand versions, nor judge pasts. A gaze that simply saw me as I was. For the first time, after the abyss, I felt I could love again. Not like before. But in a new, more mature, more serene way. And her? Well, she lives with the weight of having been the only one to lose. Because love, when it's true, isn't replaced. It's lost. And whoever loses it lives with that absence forever. To this day, she keeps that letter. The same one I read and kept. The only reminder that she was once deeply loved by someone she left, for a moment. But there's one last thing no one knows yet. Something that happened at their final reunion. Something she said at the door, her voice broken, that echoed in my mind for a long time, before I decided never to look back. And it's that last sentence, that last detail, that changes everything. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize cheating, we expose it. All the stories told are fictional, but they carry profound truths about how wrong choices can destroy true love. Our purpose is clear, to show that cheating isn't worth it, and that those who cheat always lose more than they imagine. Get ready now to dive into a story shocking, realistic and unforgettable. Take a deep breath, because what you're about to hear will move you. They met on an unpretentious evening, at a dinner with friends, the kind where conversations are laced with spontaneous laughter and glances meet by chance. Daniel, with his serene posture and attentive gaze, was the type who observed more than he spoke. Always polite, kind, with an intelligence that made no effort to be apparent. Laura, on the other hand, was the complementary opposite, expansive, cheerful, driven by intensity, with an engaging way of speaking and a gaze that seemed to pierce certainties. When the two sat side by side, it wasn't an explosive or instant interest that united them, but rather a slow exchange of words and gestures that, little by little, took invisible root. She talked about literature, he listened, and then told childhood stories with such genuine humor that it made Laura truly laugh, not like someone simply amused, but like someone who allows herself to trust. It was easy to be around him. It was easy to believe in her. Building their relationship was simple but solid. Both bore scars they didn't immediately reveal, but they knew how to respect each other's time. There were no grand promises at first, just a silent agreement that they would be there for each other, and that was enough. When they decided to share a roof, it was almost natural. Habits gradually adjusted, spaces were shared, and the routine, far from being a burden, felt like the home each of them had long sought. Laura loved cooking in the late afternoon, especially when Daniel arrived home tired from work. He would sit at the table, open a bottle of wine, and they would talk about the day as if it were the most important moment in the world. There was something special in the way they looked at each other. It wasn't desperate passion, it was something rarer, it was intimacy built, trust cultivated in the silence of small things. Daniel worked as a systems analyst at a mid-sized company. He was respected, competent, and dedicated, but he never let work distract him from his personal life. He cherished weekends at home, walks with Laura in the park, and rewatching movies on cold nights. For him, being with her was a respite, a safe zone where he could be just himself, without masks or demands. Laura, a communications graduate, had landed a good position as a coordinator at a marketing agency. She was on the rise, receiving praise and opportunities that stimulated her, and Daniel was her biggest cheerleader. He wasn't bothered by her success, on the contrary, he was proud. He applauded her achievements with shining eyes, as if witnessing the blossoming of something he helped nurture every day with patience and love. As time passed, natural challenges arose. The routine began to weigh on some days, work deadlines became more demanding, commitments piled up. But nothing seemed insurmountable. They adapted. Laura, at times, seemed more distant, absorbed in thoughts and worries she didn't voice. Daniel, for his part, tried not to pressure her. He had learned that some concerns needed time and space to emerge, and that silence was sometimes a form of care. He began waking up earlier to make coffee, leaving little notes around the house with simple but affectionate phrases. She smiled when she saw each one, but those smiles began to last less. The change was subtle. Almost imperceptible. Dinners became quieter, touches less frequent, hugs briefer. Daniel tried to ignore it as just a phase, a reflection of fatigue, the rush, the pressure of goals and commitments. Laura, on the other hand, became more and more involved in the agency's social events. She started coming home later and spoke enthusiastically about projects, campaigns, and colleagues. He listened attentively, but gradually he noticed she talked less about them. As a couple. As a joint project. The "we" gave way to an increasingly present "I." Still, he didn't complain. He didn't seem insecure. He believed relationships require patience, and he was willing to offer it. Because he loved her. Truly. In a mature, whole way, one that knows how to wait for the other to weather their storms. They were invited to an agency celebration party. An elegant evening, marked by dancing, speeches, and celebrations. Laura asked him to accompany her, and Daniel dressed carefully. He wanted to be her equal, wanted to be part of her world, even if sometimes he felt a little out of place among so many different people, among smiles he couldn't tell if they were genuine or just pretend. They arrived hand in hand. Laura seemed nervous, but she smiled. He remained discreet, observing, trying to find the right moment to ask her to dance. When he finally did, with a shy smile and a silent invitation of her outstretched hand, she hesitated. She smiled, but didn't accept. And a few minutes later, she was dancing with someone else, someone Daniel recognized from the agency. A confident, charming man who seemed to speak to Laura as if he knew her better than he should. Daniel watched with a lump in his throat. Not out of jealousy. But because he realized there was something there he no longer knew how to reach. After the party, the drive home was silent. She was fiddling with her phone, he was watching the street through the window, as if searching for answers in the streetlights whizzing by. Inside, everything was falling apart. But outwardly, he remained calm. He wouldn't make a fuss. He wouldn't make accusations. He just wanted the truth. And maybe, deep down, he already knew she wouldn't come. Not then. Still, when he got home, he decided to ask. Just once. One last chance. Because he deserved at least an explanation. In that apartment where so many memories had been made, where the smell of coffee evoked laughter and the kitchen still bore the marks of happy nights, a decision was about to be made. Nothing that had happened until then was final. It was still possible to recover. Perhaps there was still something there that could be saved. But everything would depend on an answer. On a choice. And, above all, on sincerity. It was the point where love alone was no longer enough. It took courage. Truth. And a final gesture of respect between two who had once loved each other so completely. And before the first tear fell, Daniel looked around and realized something he hadn't been able to admit until then: he was no longer the same man who had first entered that house with her. Something in him had changed. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end, but the beginning of something he didn't yet understand. But there was something that had yet to be said. A truth that had been kept hidden for too long. Something Laura would keep silent until confronted. And when that happened, nothing would ever be the same again. After that night at the party, time seemed to split in two, before and after. Daniel woke every day with the same feeling of absence, as if something essential had slipped through his fingers and he no longer knew how to get back to where they were. The bed, though large, seemed small compared to the silence that enveloped them. Laura continued to follow her routine as if everything was in the same place, as if nothing had shifted, but Daniel felt it. He felt it in every automatic gesture, in every hurried kiss, in every silent excuse not to talk, not to touch, not to look into her eyes. There was a chasm growing between them, and what hurt most was that she seemed unfazed by it. There was something in her eyes he no longer recognized, something opaque, distant, no longer reflecting the love with which she had once looked at him. He tried. He tried like few others would. He bought flowers without a date, prepared impromptu dinners on ordinary nights, called during the day just to hear her voice, tried to tell old jokes, reminisce about happy memories. But everything came back empty. Laura smiled politely, thanked him with lukewarm affection, accepted the gestures without surrendering. She was there, but not there. It was like loving someone who's gone, but left their body. And it consumed him. Daniel began to doubt himself, to look for flaws in his own reflection, to think of everything he could have done differently. He questioned if he'd let the romance die, if his predictability had become a burden, if his love was no longer enough. But there was no way to find an answer when the other person refused to be honest. The absences began to intensify. Laura said there were late-night meetings, team get-togethers, and late-night brainstorms. Daniel didn't complain. He observed. Sitting at the table, he glanced at the clock and counted the minutes as if they were clues. The smell of new perfume, the messages read and unanswered, the smiles at unusual hours. Nothing was explicit, but everything screamed. He wondered what still lingered there. If it was love or attachment. If it was hope or illusion. But he couldn't confront it yet. There was something inside him he needed to confirm. Something deeper than mere suspicion. He wanted the truth, but at the same time, he feared that hearing it would unravel everything. His friends noticed. Some tried to warn him with subtle words, others remained silent out of respect. Daniel was no longer the same. His lightness had turned to silence. His confidence to doubt. His eyes to heaviness. His conversations with Laura became scarce and objective. They talked about bills, commitments, small household chores. But they no longer spoke about themselves. He felt alone in a relationship, carrying the responsibility of maintaining something that no longer received any effort in return. Even so, he didn't give in. He stayed there. Out of love. Out of fear. Because he didn't know how to let go of something that had been such an intense part of his life. One day, when he arrived home early from work, he found the house empty, even though Laura had said she'd be home at that time. He waited. Time passed. He sent a simple message. No response. When she finally arrived, 2 hours later, she said she'd lost track of time in a meeting that ended up running long. Daniel just nodded. He didn't argue, he didn't question. But in that moment, he knew. It was the kind of absence that couldn't be justified with words. It was the absence felt in the smell that didn't suit the office environment, in the makeup touched up at an unlikely time, in the restless eyes, and in the rush to climb the stairs. Something inside him stopped fighting that day. It wasn't time to speak yet. But the decision was beginning to form. The following weekend was the final attempt. Daniel organized a simple outing, a short trip to a cabin in the mountains. A place they had both visited early in their relationship, full of fond memories and lazy afternoons with blankets, wine, and comfortable silence. She accepted, but with some resistance. She said she was tired, that there was a lot of work. Still, she went. When they got there, Laura seemed disconnected, checking her phone frequently, responding to messages with hidden smiles. Daniel said nothing. He watched. He waited. When they finally attempted a deeper conversation, she changed the subject. He asked what was going on, and she said she was just tired, that he was seeing things where they didn't exist. But her tone was different. It was a tone that ended the conversation before it began. A tone that pushed the truth away, trying to keep the house of cards standing. On the last day, as they were packing to return, he saw a notification pop up on her phone, which was unlocked on the bed. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't intrusive. It was inevitable. His name appeared. The same man from the party. The message was short, but it said more than any explanation: "I miss you already." Laura noticed Daniel's gaze fixed on the screen and, for a moment, froze. She tried to take the phone, tried to justify it. But he didn't react. He just looked at her. And in that look, everything was said. There was nothing left to hide. The betrayal that until then had been a shadow became flesh. It was real. And it was there, between them. Daniel took a deep breath. The pain was no longer a scream, it was silence. A silence that weighed more heavily than any confrontation. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't demand explanations. He didn't want details. The love that once existed deserved a more dignified end than accusations. On the way back, there were no words. Only the rumble of tires on the road and the muffled sound of held breath. When they arrived home, Daniel calmly got out of the car, went inside, gathered his things, and, in front of her, simply said that he couldn't continue. He asked her to be honest, to at least tell the truth for that moment. And that's when she confessed. She said she was involved, that things had started unintentionally, but now they were real. That she no longer felt the same. That she might never feel the same again. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't cry. When she finished, he stood firm, saying only that he hoped she would find in the other what he once tried to be for her. He left the house where he once built dreams, carrying with him not only clothes, but the memory of what he had been and would never be again. But what he didn't yet know was that behind that betrayal, there was something more. Something she never told him. Something that, when it comes to light, will put everything they've experienced into perspective. A secret that will make it clear that the pain he felt was still far from over. Time passed as if trying to erase its traces. Daniel continued his life in silence, in no rush to start over. There was something in his presence that seemed calmer, as if the storm had left a different kind of maturity in his eyes. He carried no hatred, no desire for revenge. Just silence. A silence born of a heart weary of offering love to those who couldn't hold it. He kept his distance. He didn't seek news. He changed his number, his habits, even his smile seemed different, less impulsive, more sincere. And when, by chance, he heard his name mentioned by a mutual acquaintance, he responded with a calmness that disconcerted those expecting an explosive reaction. He wasn't trying to forget, but to learn to live with the absence of what had once been essential. Laura, on the other hand, spent the first few months trying to justify to herself that she had made the right choice. That she had sought happiness, that she had the right to experience something new. She repeated this to the mirror every day, like a mantra that was beginning to lose its power. Her involvement with the other man, the boss who had seemed so charming at first, proved too fleeting. The shallow conversations, the lack of real interest, the lack of depth began to weigh on her. He didn't know her quirks, didn't remember her preferences, didn't understand her silences. It was like living with a stranger who only knew how to touch the surface. And the hardest part was realizing that, little by little, she was becoming a superficial version of herself. What at first seemed like freedom began to transform into disconnection. She tried to contact Daniel a few times, but never got a response. She wrote messages that she deleted before sending. She tried using mutual friends to start casual conversations, but he remained steadfast in his silence. And that hurt more than any words. Until one day, as she was leaving work, she saw him by chance in a coffee shop they used to frequent. He was sitting, smiling, talking to a woman she didn't know. His expression was calm, as if he'd rediscovered something good within himself. Laura stood frozen, watching from afar. For the first time, she felt he had truly moved on. Not in a rush, not in anger. But truly. And that broke her. She returned home in tears, staring at the walls of the empty apartment as if they were laughing at her loneliness. It was a week later that she decided to go to him. Not to beg, not to try to rebuild something she knew no longer existed. But because she needed to ask for forgiveness. For everything. For the omission, for the lack of courage, for the betrayal, for the wasted love. When he opened the door and saw her standing there, with swollen eyes and a choked voice, he showed no surprise. It was as if he had already known that, sooner or later, this meeting would happen. She asked him to listen to her, nothing more. And he, with the same serenity of someone who had already rebuilt his world, allowed it. They sat at the table, as they had so often before, but now there was an irreversible distance between them. She began to speak. She wasn't crying, but her voice trembled. She said she'd made a mistake, that she'd been weak, that she'd exchanged love for illusion. She said she'd understood too late his value, the kind of love he offered, and how rare it was for someone to love so completely. He listened without interrupting. His eyes were steady, but not cold. It was as if he were listening to someone else's story. When she finished, he remained silent for a few seconds. Then, in a calm tone, he said he had already forgiven. That he held no grudges, that he wished no harm. That he had learned from the pain and that, because of that, he had been able to move on. Laura swallowed hard. This was more painful than any insult. Because his forgiveness came with a definitive separation. She was being forgiven, but she would no longer be a part of his life. But before leaving, she took a folded sheet of paper from her bag. It was the letter he'd written months earlier, which he'd left in a drawer in their house, too afraid to deliver. She found it by chance and read it. And in that letter was everything. The love, the suffering, the hope that still lingered. She said she carried it with her every day and that it was because of that letter that she'd returned. Because she finally understood what she'd lost. Daniel took the paper, scanned the words, and smiled wistfully. He said that letter had been written by a man who was still waiting. But now, that man was no more. And then, she took a deep breath and looked into his eyes with something deeper than regret. There was guilt, yes. There was sadness. But there was also a weight she hadn't yet revealed. And it was then, in a low, measured voice, that she decided to tell him what she'd been holding back since the end. Something Daniel could never have imagined. She said that her involvement with her boss hadn't started as he thought. That it wasn't a casual flirtation or a sudden crush. That, in fact, her boss had intentionally gotten closer. Not out of lust alone. But because of something that involved Daniel. The man knew who he was. He knew about his professional involvement with a partner company that was about to close a multi-million-dollar contract. And it was Laura, without realizing it at first, who ended up being the link to the information he wanted to uncover. Daniel, upon hearing that, frowned. It didn't make sense. But she continued. She said that, at an informal dinner, her boss had asked specific questions about Daniel, his projects, his contacts. At first, she thought it was common curiosity. Just another conversation between two people. But over time, she realized something was wrong. The man seemed to know too much. He demanded answers. He created situations to manipulate her. When she tried to walk away, it was too late. She was emotionally involved. And, worse, her boss had already gotten everything he wanted. And so, he discarded her. Like waste paper. Daniel rose from his chair, confused, trying to process it. She then pulled a small recording from her pocket. An audio recording. It was a conversation between her and her ex-lover. His voice was clear. He said Laura had been helpful while she was needed. That Daniel was naive, that he had made everything easy. And that now it was time to move on to the next target. Daniel listened in silence. His hands trembled. Not from the pain of betrayal, but from the feeling of having been deceived on so many levels. Not just as a husband, but as a man. As a professional. As a human being. Laura tried to justify herself. He said he didn't know, that he only understood the plan when he was already in the middle. That she tried to avoid it, but was pulled into a web. He said he never wanted to hurt Daniel. But at the same time, he also didn't have the courage to tell him before. And now, there, exposed, she didn't want to lie anymore. She needed him to know the truth. To understand that, beyond the betrayal of body and soul, there was also a betrayal of the most basic trust, that, within the home, no one would bring the enemy closer. Daniel took a deep breath. He looked at her. And in that gaze, there was no longer anger. There was disappointment. A weariness that only those who have loved deeply could feel. He said he understood. That everything made sense now. But that, even with all the explanations, there was no way to rebuild what had been destroyed. Her time had passed. And he was already somewhere else. Inside himself. And outside of there too. Laura cried. Not with the cry of someone who wants to return. But with the cry of someone who understands they've already lost. That what they held in their hands slipped through their fingers and would never return. She tried to hold his hand for a moment, but he gently pulled away. And before standing, he said the last words she would hear from him there, I loved you. In a way you may never know again. And for that, I forgive you. But I'm not going back. And she stood there. Alone. In the chair that had once been shared by two. With the letter in her hand, her face wet, and the certainty that she had exchanged the love of her life for an illusion that wasn't even real. Laura remained seated for several minutes after Daniel left. Time seemed suspended inside that apartment, where the silence weighed more heavily than any scream. The walls held too many memories for the space to feel neutral, and every object, the cup on the table, the plant by the window, the books carefully stacked on the shelf, seemed to accuse her with a kind of silent melancholy. What hurt most wasn't the end. It was the way it happened, her having to face, with her own eyes, how much Daniel had rebuilt himself, how whole he was in the face of the truth that crushed her. There was no fight, no contempt, no scandal. There was forgiveness. But that was precisely what tore her apart. Because his forgiveness didn't come with a fresh start. It came with a farewell. In the days that followed, Laura tried to return to her routine, but nothing about it seemed to make sense. Work, which had once occupied her mind with an almost addictive intensity, now felt mechanical, empty. She no longer recognized herself as the woman she had been months ago, the one who believed she could exchange a solid love for a desire that would evaporate at the first confrontation with reality. She began to walk the city streets as if carrying a burden of guilt, and in every face, in every shop window, she searched for signs of what she had lost. There was no pride left. Only the knowledge that Daniel was no longer a memory, but a destiny she had rejected and that now belonged to someone else, to another time. Daniel, for his part, plunged headlong into a new phase of his life. He began visiting different places, adopting new habits, and meeting people with stories that, in a way, helped him put his own pain into perspective. It was at a photography exhibition, almost by chance, that he met Julia, a woman with a calm gaze and precise words. She bore no resemblance to Laura, and perhaps that's why she piqued Daniel's interest. They talked about art, books, and silence. But unlike all the conversations he'd had since leaving that relationship, this one wasn't heavy. It didn't require explanations. It didn't demand protection. It was light, like a breeze blowing through a window after a long storm. Meetings with Julia became more frequent, first in cafes, then in parks, then at unpretentious dinners. She didn't intrude, she didn't demand anything. And that made Daniel relax. He allowed himself to laugh again. Little by little, without realizing it, he was regaining parts of himself he'd thought were lost. He didn't fall in love right away. But something inside him began to pulse again. A genuine curiosity about the other person's life. A desire to share, albeit cautiously, what remained of his affection. Julia didn't ask about Laura. She just listened when he naturally brought up the subject. And when he finally told her everything, in the most raw way, she simply held his hand and said that every fall forges a new path, and that love, to happen again, didn't need to repeat formulas, it just needed to be true. Meanwhile, Laura was drowning in thoughts that kept her awake. She reread Daniel's letter more than 20 times, listened to the audio of the betrayal countless times. And it was on a cold, rainy night, after yet another anxiety attack, that she decided to call an old friend, someone who had been by her side in the early days of her marriage. They talked for hours, and in the end, the friend said with unexpected harshness that perhaps Laura had, indeed, lost the right man, not because he was perfect, but because he was real, whole, someone who loved her to the limit. That hit her hard. For the first time, she didn't try to justify herself. She just cried. Months passed. Daniel and Julia grew ever closer. There was a mutual respect between them that didn't require promises, but that, day after day, connected them in something honest. She knew his traits, and he valued her silence. It was different, mature, unhurried. And that's why it worked. One day, on an ordinary afternoon, as they walked hand in hand through the city center, they crossed paths, without warning, with Laura. It was quick, intense, inevitable. She stopped when she saw him. Daniel did too. Julia noticed immediately, but said nothing. She simply gently released his hand and took a discreet step aside. Laura looked at them both, and with teary eyes, whispered a barely audible hello. Daniel responded with a gentle nod, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. There was no more pain on his face. But there was also no more space. Laura tried to hold back the tears, but failed. She said she was happy to see him well, and that he deserved it. He thanked her. He said she deserved peace too. She tried to smile, but it was a smile that carried more regret than joy. Julia then approached, with a polite gesture, and extended her hand to Laura. She accepted it, with a hesitant squeeze, and in that brief touch, she understood everything. Julia was the kind of woman Daniel had always sought. Not because she looked like Laura, but because she was the opposite of the pain she caused. She was calm, firm, gentle. She was everything Laura couldn't be when she had the chance. After that encounter, Laura understood there was no going back. That the life she had destroyed with her choices was now in other hands. And that no matter how much she regretted it, no matter how much she understood her mistakes, she could no longer go back in time. She would carry that love as a memory that both hurt and taught. And Daniel? He stayed with Julia, in no rush to name their relationship. He had learned that love, when it's meant to last, doesn't require urgency, it simply grows, silently, until it occupies the right space. One Sunday morning, while they were making coffee together, Daniel received another letter. This time, without a return address. It was from Laura. A final one. In it, she said she didn't expect a reply, that she asked for nothing more, that she just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for loving her so truly. Thank you for teaching her what true love was. And that she hoped, from the bottom of her heart, that he would be happy. Daniel folded the letter carefully, put it in a box with the first one, and in that moment, he allowed himself to close the door to the past lightly. It was the final scar. The mark that no longer hurts. It only shows how much he survived. And when Julia asked what was in the letter, he replied with a calm smile, a goodbye that came too late. After that, he didn't speak of it again. Because there was nothing left that needed to be said. The cycle closed there. No shouting, no hatred. Just the certainty that true love, when betrayed, can even be forgiven. But never, never will it be forgotten. And some losses teach more than 1,000 promises. What Laura would never know, however, was that Daniel, the night before their reunion, had dreamed about her. A brief, confusing dream, in which she appeared sitting on the old apartment balcony, reading the same letter he had written months earlier. In the dream, she looked at him with tears in her eyes and told him she still loved him. When he woke, Daniel felt strange. But he decided not to think about it anymore. Now he understood, the subconscious was simply trying to wrap up what the heart had already left behind. It was an echo. Nothing more. And when, weeks later, he and Julia traveled together for the first time, a simple trip to the countryside, he felt something blossom within him again. A peace that demanded no explanation. A gratitude for having survived it all. And, above all, the certainty that true love is not measured by how long it lasts, but by how much it transforms those who experienced it. Laura was a chapter. Remarkable, yes. But finite. And Julia, now, was the good silence after the pain. It was a new beginning, not out of need, but out of deservingness. It was finally the new place where love could live again. Life seemed to move steadily forward after the letter. Daniel had returned to his routine with a new kind of serenity that not even he fully recognized. There was no rush in absolutely anything. The days had color, but they were no longer colored by anxiety, a desire for control, or a need to prove anything. It was as if time was finally on his side. Julia, with her calm and firm presence, filled the space beside him without suffocating. She didn't demand, she didn't pressure, she simply walked alongside. And perhaps that was the most surprising thing, she didn't try to erase Daniel's past or compete with him. She accepted him as part of what had made him who he was. And he, for the first time in years, didn't need to hide any pain, any scars. He was whole. Even though he carried deep scars, he now knew how to use them as part of his strength. Some mornings, as he silently sipped coffee on the porch, Daniel allowed himself to revisit memories without them hurting him. The letter he'd received from Laura, now kept with the other, wasn't a burden, but a reminder that love, when true, isn't weakness. He felt no pleasure in having overcome her. There was no vanity. What remained was a silent empathy. He knew she was dealing with the pain of loss in a more painful, slower, perhaps irreversible way. But this didn't comfort him. It only reaffirmed what was already clear: not all love given finds the same value in the receiver. And while forgiving is a grand gesture, forgiving isn't forgetting, much less starting over. It was simply freeing oneself from a weight that no longer fit. Their chance reunion, days ago, still echoed in his mind curiously. Not out of longing, but because of the silent impact it had caused. Seeing Laura before him, fragile, trying to hold back tears, knowing there was no room for anything else, was the final image that remained from that story. A silent and respectful, yet definitive, ending. Daniel knew she would never forget him, and that, somehow, weighed heavily on him. Because, no matter how much he moved on, there was no happiness possible in the pain of another when that pain stems from love that was mistreated. He didn't want her to suffer forever. He simply wanted her to learn. To transform that loss into something that would prevent her from repeating the same mistakes. That was his sincerest hope, though never voiced. With Julia, conversations flowed naturally. It was a different rhythm. She didn't make him forget Laura, and he never sought that from her, but she reminded him that love can also be light, sincere, and possible. She knew the details. The betrayal, the discovery, the use, the forgiveness. And she never seemed threatened. This made Daniel trust her even more. Between them, there were no masks. They both knew they were walking on ground where the past had left scars. And it was precisely this mutual awareness that strengthened their bond. They allowed themselves to love not through the emptiness of an absence, but through the strength of a choice. It was there, on this new path, that his story was being redefined. Meanwhile, Laura dealt with the other side of the aftermath. The loneliness that followed pride. The long nights, the heavy silences, the regret that took shape in small details. A restaurant they frequented together, the smell of coffee that reminded her of Sundays together, music playing in the background of a random pharmacy. She tried to fill her time with work, with classes, with friends who now looked at her with a certain silent compassion. But there was something in her expression that betrayed the loss. The downcast eyes, the short smiles, the lack of sparkle. Her own family avoided discussing the subject, but everyone knew. They knew she had destroyed something rare, and they knew she paid for it every day. Not with external punishments, but with the kind of pain one only feels when one realizes true love is no longer within reach. One particular night, Laura went on a blind date, encouraged by a friend who told her she needed to get back to life. The man was friendly, kind, and polite. The conversation was light, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe that she could, perhaps, start over. But at the end of the night, when he dropped her off and asked if he could see her again, Laura hesitated. He smiled gently but made no promises. When she got home, she sat on the couch and cried. She cried because she understood she wasn't ready yet. That there was still a wound inside her that was too open to ignore. That the love he lost still pulsed in her memory. And that perhaps, no matter how many other people she met, no new love could fill a space where the shadow of what she destroyed still lived. Meanwhile, Daniel had been invited to participate in a lecture on ethics and trust in the technology sector. It was an important event, with renowned professionals, and his name among the speakers. It was a public recognition that crowned not only his competence but also his upright approach to life. As he took the stage, dressed discreetly and serenely, he looked at the audience and took a deep breath. He spoke about systems and innovation, but concluded his presentation with a phrase that seemed to have come straight from the depths of his soul: trust is the only system that, when broken, never starts again from the same point. You can even rebuild it. But it will never be the same. He received applause, but in his heart, that phrase was less for others and more for himself. Leaving the event, he found Julia waiting for him. She smiled, handed him a small flower tucked into a napkin, and told him he had been brilliant. He thanked her, but the look he exchanged with her said more than any words. It was the kind of complicity that isn't built overnight. It was the reflection of what was learned through pain and rebuilt through hope. They walked together down a quiet street, and in that complicit silence, Daniel felt he was exactly where he should be. Not in the past, nor in the future. But right here. Present. That same night, as she lay down to sleep, Laura opened the drawer where she kept Daniel's first letter. She read it aloud, as if speaking to someone. At the end, she simply said, "I'm sorry," as if he could still hear her. After that, she closed her eyes and slept. For the first time, without dreaming about him. For the first time, accepting, however painfully, that her place in Daniel's story no longer existed. She didn't know if she would ever love again, but she knew that love, that particular one, would never return. The next day, Daniel woke up next to Julia. She was fast asleep, her hair spread out on the pillow, her expression light. He lay there for a few minutes, simply observing. He thought about everything he'd experienced, everything he'd lost, but above all, everything he'd learned. The past was there, but it no longer dominated him. The future was uncertain, but it no longer frightened him. And the present, finally, was a place he could inhabit without pain. But there was still something to come. Something neither Daniel, Laura, nor Julia could have foreseen. A dilemma that would arise unexpectedly, confronting not only the logic of the choices made, but the essence of what it truly means to love, and to be loved after such profound loss. And this final, silent, subtle twist would change more than their fates, it would change how each of them viewed themselves. A few months had passed since Daniel and Laura's silent reunion, since the icy touch of that last letter left on his desk. Life seemed to have followed its natural course, like a current that pushes even those who don't want to move. But the current doesn't erase everything. Some things remain in the background, haunting the calmest moments. Daniel continued to build a serene, mature relationship with Julia, far from everything that had hurt him. However, like all old wounds, no matter how healed they may seem, they sometimes throb. It wasn't the pain of lost love that bothered him, but the complexity of forgiveness. He had forgiven, yes, but he now wondered what, exactly, he had forgiven: the betrayal, the omission, or himself, for ignoring the signs. These kinds of questions don't find easy answers. They arise in deep silences, in the wee hours of the morning, when even the breath of the other person beside him seems a reminder that there are things that will never be fully understood. It was one winter night, on a short trip he and Julia took to visit a literary fair in the countryside, that something changed again. Sitting in a rustic restaurant, by the window, the sound of the wind blowing outside, Daniel received an unexpected call. The number wasn't saved, but he recognized the voice when he answered. It was Laura's father. A man he hadn't spoken to since the breakup, but who had always respected him deeply. On the other end of the line, he didn't explain much, simply saying he needed to see him. There was something important to say. His voice was tense, heavy, as if carrying a weight he could no longer bear alone. Daniel hesitated. Julia, sensing the tension, silently held his hand under the table. He hung up and told her what it was. She didn't ask him to stay, nor did she encourage him to go. She simply said that, whatever his decision, she would be there when he returned. The next day, Daniel traveled alone. The road seemed longer than he remembered. When he arrived at Laura's father's house, he was greeted with a look that mixed relief and pain. They sat on the porch, and the man took a while to speak. Finally, with a broken voice, he revealed that Laura was leaving to live abroad. A sudden decision, made after months of failed attempts to start over there, in the same place where everything reminded her of Daniel. But it wasn't just that. There was something more. A truth she had hidden from him, from her father, from everyone. And that now, at the last moment, she had asked him to tell her. Daniel didn't understand right away. But upon hearing the next words, he felt the ground give way beneath his feet. Laura's father said that, shortly before the termination, she had discovered she was expecting a child. A child that was Daniel's. And that, afraid, confused, and faced with the choice she had already made to be with someone else, she hid it. She lost the baby in the following weeks, silently, without ever telling anyone. Not to her mother, not to her friends. She kept it as a silent punishment. But after the betrayal, after the abandonment, and especially after her last conversation with him, she had understood that she couldn't carry this forever. And that she needed him to know. Daniel couldn't speak. The wind was cold, and everything around him seemed distant. A son. A son he never knew existed. A betrayed love, a destroyed home, and yet, there was something there, something that had never had the chance to be born. He stood and walked a few steps across the yard, feeling the world around him slow down. Laura's father just waited, respecting the silence. After a while, Daniel returned and thanked him. He said he didn't blame anyone. But that this changed everything. Not in the present, but in how the past would be remembered from then on. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. When he got back to the hotel, he called Julia and told her everything. Every word, every detail. She listened in silence. And when he finished, her answer was simple: this is part of your story. And you don't have to carry it alone. He cried for the first time in a long time. Not for the son he'd lost, but for the certainty that there was someone now, by his side, capable of supporting even the pain he didn't yet know how to handle. Laura, upon learning her father had told her, wrote a final message. You didn't apologize. You didn't try to justify yourself. You simply said that he knew everything now. That she wasn't the same anymore. And that you sincerely hoped he could be happy for two. Daniel didn't respond. Not out of contempt, but because there were no more words. He kept the message, and for the first time, he felt that the cycle was truly over. The days that followed were not easy. Grief for something that never existed manifested itself in unexpected ways. But there was Julia. And there was the present. Daniel began writing his own story. A book, not about betrayal, nor revenge. But about new beginnings. About choices. About how, sometimes, love must die so we can learn to love again. Each chapter contained fragments of what he had experienced, what he had lost, and what he had found. Julia read each passage carefully, and said, with eyes full of tenderness, that there was something greater than pain, there was transformation. Meanwhile, Laura was boarding a plane to another country. She carried few bags, no clear plans. Only the desire to start over. Not with another love. But with herself. She knew she would never have Daniel again. She knew she had destroyed more than just the relationship. But now she understood that perhaps her biggest mistake had been never allowing herself to know who she truly was before loving someone. On the last night before leaving, she returned to the porch of her parents' house, where she had so often dreamed of a life that now belonged to someone else. And there, silently, she gave thanks. Not for the pain. But for the chance to start over, even if it was too late. Daniel finished the book and published it discreetly. He didn't expect success or recognition. But the words found readers. And among the messages he received from those touched by the story was one from a woman who said, "Thank you for writing what so many of us feel but never get to say." He smiled. He kept the message. And that night, as he looked at Julia sleeping, he knew that his story, with all its losses and new beginnings, had finally found its place. But something would remain with him for a long time. Not as pain, but as a memory. The fact that, despite having lost so much, he never stopped loving truly. And that, in the end, this was what made him stronger than any betrayal. Because there are loves that, even when they don't last, teach what it means to truly love. And this learning, once experienced, is never lost. Time doesn't heal everything, but it teaches us to live with the scars. And for Daniel, the greatest scar wasn't the betrayal, nor the pain of discovering what had been done behind his back, but rather the silence that followed. A silence that no longer screamed, but whispered memories in small, everyday moments. He learned that some absences hurt more than any verbal goodbye. Yet there was an undeniable peace in the way life reconfigured itself. The relationship with Julia wasn't a consolation prize, it was a rebirth. They remained together, with the kind of love that doesn't require bandages, but respects the scars. They now lived in a small house with large windows and a balcony where he would write at dawn while she watered the plants. It was a simple setting, but complete. And it was there, in the most ordinary of everyday life, that he found what intensity couldn't sustain: emotional stability, mutual respect, the security to be vulnerable without fear. Daniel published his second book. This time, it wasn't a story of new beginnings, but of choices. A narrative where love was tested by illusion, where the characters lost themselves to the point where they had to decide whether it was possible to rebuild something or if the most honorable thing was to let it fall apart. The book touched many people, especially those who had experienced relationships that were broken from within even before an official separation. He received messages every day, and in many of them, there was a common theme: how cruel it is to realize that true love isn't always enough to hold on to someone determined to leave. In an interview with a literary channel, Daniel clearly answered his thoughts on this: true love doesn't beg, doesn't humiliate, doesn't grovel. It offers. And if it's not appreciated, it withdraws. Because love cannot exist where there is no reciprocity. On the other side of the world, Laura lived in a small, quiet coastal town. She taught languages and lived in a modest apartment overlooking the sea. She didn't talk about Daniel to anyone. He kept everything in old diaries that he never showed anyone. Her outlook was more mature now, her attitude more restrained. She no longer sought out grand passions, nor harbored hopes of reliving the past. She had finally accepted that some loves pass through our lives only once and, if destroyed, never return. The pain was still there, but it no longer paralyzed her. It had transformed into melancholy and, at times, gratitude. Laura knew she had lost the right man for the wrong reasons. She knew she had traded an entire love for a fragile fantasy and that she had paid a heavy price for it. And although she had forgiven herself over time, she never forgot the weight of the choices she had made. Sometimes, in silence, I'd look at the sea and imagine what it would have been like if I'd chosen to stay, if I'd faced my fears, if I'd been honest. But the "if" doesn't change reality. It only serves to show how different the present could be. Years later, by coincidence, she found Daniel's book in a small local bookstore. She read the dedication and knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that the last chapter was about them. There was no direct mention of her name, but the story was theirs. And as she closed the book, sitting at the bookstore's cafe table, she cried. But not with sadness. She cried for everything that was left unsaid. For everything that was lost before it even had a chance to grow. For everything she destroyed, even without knowing she was doing it so forcefully. And there, for the first time, she accepted that the pain we inflict on others never completely disappears. It merely shifts. Now, she would carry it alone. Not as punishment, but as a constant reminder of what it means to waste a love that was given to us completely. Julia, in turn, became the calm center of Daniel's world. It was with her that he shared cold nights, unpublished books, his deepest thoughts, and even the small inconveniences of the day. She was different from all the other women he'd known. Not because she was more perfect, but because she understood that loving someone who's been deeply hurt requires care, patience, and presence. And she never failed in this. She never tried to erase his past, but rather helped him build a present where that past no longer defined who he was. They moved to a new city together, opened a small bookstore cafe, and created a space where stories like theirs could find shelter in pages, coffee, and understanding glances. And even with all the time that passed, Daniel never forgot the son he never knew. Not out of grief, but out of respect. In every chapter of the books he wrote, there was a subtle trace of that absence. A silent space. A name that was never chosen, but that inhabited the spaces between the words. It was his way of keeping alive a part of himself that no one else could access. It needed no tributes, nor emotion. It was intimate. It was his. And that was enough. In the end, each went their own way. Laura learned to live with what she lost. Daniel with what she survived. Julia with what she knew how to build. None of them emerged unscathed. But they all carried, in some way, the consequences of a love that was born pure but was tainted by doubt, absence, and the wrong choice. And perhaps this is the great tragedy of many stories: love is not destroyed by hate, but by the lack of courage to protect it when it most needs nurturing. And now, after all this, I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Which part resonated with you the most? Comment below and tell me your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It helps bring more stories like this, stories that touch, that transform, that make you think. The greatest lesson this story teaches is simple yet profound: betrayal doesn't just break promises, it destroys homes, kills true feelings, and transforms entire people into pieces that are difficult to rebuild. Sometimes, the price of a momentary choice is the definitive loss of a love that will never be repeated. It's not worth it. Because true love doesn't come along every day, and when it leaves, it takes with it a part that no one can return. And remember, this channel does not condone any kind of cheating. Here, we show the real pain it causes. Cheating isn't entertainment, it's destruction. Until the next story.